Hello, welcome to Ecotactics conversation series on environmental research practices hosted by Generation. Ecotactics focuses on the exploratory methodologies for fieldwork, ecopedagogy, and environmental literacy. This program is weaving together a network of practitioners who have been experimenting with novel approaches for ecological research, crossing the fields of arts and sound anthropology, media studies, hydrofeminism, and pedagogical activism. Past sessions included anthropologist of sound Stephen Feld and architect Godofredo Pereira, as well as Melody Ju, the media theorist, who was with us some weeks ago. And all the recordings are available online on Generation website and YouTube channel. For today's session, I have invited a very special guest, astrida neimanis, who is a cultural theorist working at the intersection of feminism and environmental change. Her research focuses on bodies, water, and weather, and how they can help us reimagine justice, care, responsibility, and relation in time of climate catastrophe. She's director of Field Lab for Collaborative and Interdisciplinary Environmental Humanities Field Lab, located at unceded Silex territory in Kelowna, BC. Her most recent book, Bodies of Water, Posthuman Feminist Phenomenology, is a call for humans to examine our relationships to oceans, watersheds, and other aquatic life forms from the perspective of our own primarily water bodies and our ecological, poetic, and political connections to other bodies of water. Additional research interests include theories and practice of interdisciplinarity, feminist epistemologies, intersectionality, multi-species justice, and everyday militarisms. Astrida's research practice includes collaborations with artists, writers, scientists, makers, educational institutions, and communities, often in the form of experimental public pedagogies. I think we're going to be hearing about her practice and her most recent research laboratory today, and I'm really excited to have this conversation opportunity to really expand on some of the methodologies that I've really admired through the years, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Astrida.
Thank you so much, Margarida. I am such a big fan of your work and what you do, so it really is my honor to be here today. Yes, I'm speaking to you today from the unceded lands of the Syilx Okanagan people in a place also known as Kelowna, BC. And I want to express my deep gratitude for the Syilx people and the immense work they've done since time immemorial to keep this place such a beautiful and fecund place to live and work and play. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about method. I'm going to share my screen to start. So today I'm going to talk about method, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to do so. I have a bit of a presentation that's a bit loosely scripted ready for you, and I'm looking forward to some more informal discussion when I'm done. The thing I want to talk about is something called field work. Feel being like feelings, F-E-E-L-E-D. It's a feminist methodology for thinking in or as an expanded field. What I'm going to do is give you first a bit of a backstory about how and why I became interested in method. And I'm going to offer a provisional definition of sorts of how I understand this thing I'm calling fieldwork. And then I'm going to briefly go through a few of the methodological principles that guide this work. And I want to stress that I didn't think of these before I started. It's only now, sort of many years later, as I'm looking back over my shoulder at where I've arrived, that I understand the sorts of principles or tactics that have guided the development of this methodology. And I'm going to end by providing some examples of how I've put this into practice. And then we'll have questions and discussion, which I'm really looking most forward to. So let me begin with a bit of a reflection on why I am super interested in methodology. Because as Margarida noted in the introduction, I'm actually a theorist. And for many scholars like me who've been trained in humanities disciplines like philosophy and cultural theory and feminist theory, we never really talked much or learned much about method. We read things and we thought things and we wrote things, and reading and writing were taken as really just self-explanatory practices. The world of books ostensibly had all the answers we would ever need. And our goal as emerging scholars was simply to add our own very clever book to the stack of books that we were reading. But two things happened to me to get me thinking more about method. And again, these are moments that only looking back do I understand them really as important turning points. One of them was actually in the first year of my PhD work, 2001, when I took a course in philosophy of the body with somebody named Professor Samuel Mallon. My primary interest at the time was in feminist theories of embodiment, so this course seemed like a really good idea. And I was expecting that we would simply be reading more books. But Sam asked us to do two things in this course that have really changed the way that I think and work as a philosopher or as a theorist. First, he said we were only going to read one book all term. And maybe we wouldn't even get through the whole book. I remember him saying this and I was like, what? I'm here to read lots of books. But he's like, no, we're going to read one book, Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. The second thing he said was that we were going to think with our bodies. Using a method that Sam had developed and which he called body hermeneutics, we were going to pay attention to all of the ways in which our bodies know things. And our bodies were going to be instruments of serious philosophical inquiry. How do things feel or touch or smell or sound? How does your body move or sense or relate to things in the world? And, of course, for artists or other sort of practical researchers, this might seem completely banal, but you have to remember that philosophers and theorists aren't asked to actually do philosophy in grad school. Rather, we are asked to read philosophy and write about it. But in Sam's class, we were explicitly asked to pay attention to our bodies as a way to come up with our own modest philosophical offerings. And this was entirely revelatory. The fact that not only would I be doing philosophy, but that philosophy didn't just come from here. It came from being out in the world and understanding my body's relationship to the world. So this was such an important turning point. The second one was a few years later in 2013, I was invited by an artist who you may know, his name is Oren Katz, to accompany a group of artists on a field trip of sorts to the Biological Field Research Station in Kilpisjärvi, Finland, where we were going to explore the still existing wreckage of a crashed World War II Junkers bomber in the subarctic landscape. We took soil samples at the site of the crash. We sent them to a lab in Tromsø for metagenomic sequencing. We used dowsing sticks to ask questions about the crash. We collected berries and examined animal scat and heard stories from a very old Air Force pilot who was still alive. We swam in the lake, which was very cold. We sat in the sauna. We hired a drone. We took photos. We described different kinds of lichen. All of this was so discombobulating to me. I kept wanting to ask, why? What are we looking for? And I was so fascinated by the answer. We don't know yet. This experience was, again, totally transformative for me as a writer and a theorist. Working collaboratively with artists in the field influenced me profoundly because artists, or at least the ones I was working with, tested things out materially. They asked questions and then looked for answers in the field. And I thought, why don't theorists do this too? So both of these things had me really starting to think more about method, experimenting with different ways of coming to knowledge in embodied, sensory, emplaced, and situated ways. I have actually a couple of photos here from my time in Kilpisjärvi about almost 10 years ago now. That's our little crew on the one side of the photo. What I What I want to say, though, is that when thinking about method, I actually wanted to ask myself, why? Like, why is method or methodology important to me? And in preparing for this talk, I've actually come up with a few reasons that I want to share with you. The first is that when you have a method or a methodology, so a way of doing something, you can articulate a practice of creative constraints. Practice and its constraints can hold you and, in a good way, discipline you. Having a practice lets you trust the process. Secondly, I was really interested in thinking about method and methodology because it forced me to think about rigor. When you have a method, you can be rigorous rather than haphazard. A methodology, so a way of doing things, a logic to how it is you do things. A methodology demands that you approach your work seriously and rigorously. Thirdly, if you have a methodology, your readers and your audience can judge the validity of what you find. Of course, validity is always relative to your stated method, right? Things are only valid in relation to what it is you set out to do or look for. And if you don't have a method or a methodology, it's impossible to ascertain if your research is valid. Fourth, having a method and a methodology means that you can be accountable to it. You can hold yourself accountable to its ethos and its values, and other people can too. And this was really important for me to articulate these four things because, again, theorists and philosophers don't generally speak of having a method. So I thought, if I'm going to learn these things from artists, I'm not an artist, I'm a theorist. If I'm going to learn these things from embodied phenomenology, I want to have a practice, a way of being rigorous, and a way that others can sort of read or experience what it is I'm doing, and also hold me accountable to what it is that I've set out to do. So this is a brief summary of some of the reasons why I came to think about myself as a theorist, as having a certain kind of methodology, and why having that methodology was important. What I want to move on to now is talking about then this method and methodology that has emerged from the last decade or so of my practice. And only recently, about 2 years ago, I started calling it fieldwork. I've thought a lot about what fieldwork means and how I might define it or explain it to others. And this is what I've come up with. Fieldwork is an interdisciplinary, intermedial, intertextual, intercontextual practice of feminist environmental storytelling that prioritizes feeling as a foundational way of knowing in an expanded field. So what I do, which is, being in the field, thinking in the field with other things, with other bodies, with some of whom are people, some of whom are not people, according to feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and accessible ways of, being. This method that I've come up with is similar to other things that other philosophers, anthropologists, geographers, environmental humanists are doing. It's similar to things like what Anna Tsing has called the arts of noticing, or what others such as Stefan Helmreich has called multi-species ethnography. It has links to ecopoetics and material eco-criticism. It draws on, and I've certainly learned from Donna Haraway's practice and what Joseph Dumit has called, Haraway's implosion method. It has links to what a group of environmental humanists are calling field philosophy. And of course, there are lots of tie-ins to artistic practice and social art practice and other kinds of, experimental, collaborative performance. But it's not any of those things exactly. Fieldwork, as I'm calling it, has its own set of principles and logics. Again, a methodology means it's, a set of logics or a way of doing your method. And it has reasons for why I do this and not that. So while I'm acknowledging my connection to and learning from and indebtedness to some of these other kinds of environmental methods, I'm taking this opportunity now to sort of describe to you why I think field work is something a little bit different. First of all, as you can tell from the name, field work is about feeling. What do I mean by feeling? As you might have already guessed from the little introduction I gave you about how it is I got here, feeling is embodied knowledge. Yeah. Feeling is tactile. Feeling is texture, mouthfeel, getting to know something through contact by your sensory organs. So feeling is that actual physical and material sense of a body in relation to other things in the world. Feeling is also emotional or affective knowledge. Feeling here is driven by a passion, right? We know things because our bodies ask us to feel things, even if what we feel is not much at all. I also want to stress that when I'm, sort of putting feeling as the foundation of this practice, I don't mean that feeling is in opposition to rational or scientific or other forms of knowledge. Feeling and field work is actually very interested in how scientific knowledges also feel. In field work, scientific knowledge is parsed through feeling apparatuses in order to thicken it, to bring that kind of rational or scientific inquiry back to the knowing bodies and the worlds that enliven that work. Yeah, so field work, and I'm calling it field work, F-E-E-L, is a methodology that begins with bodies that feel. Yeah, so that's its sort of grounding premise. The other thing, of course, that you'll notice about this neologism, field work, is that it happens in or as a field. So before saying more, I wanted to say a couple of words about what is a field, or how it is that I understand the field. So in the first instance, I choose this idea of a field to invoke what is beyond the narrow focus on books or just textual practice that sort of was the foundation of my training as a humanities scholar. Instead, field work is, boots on the ground, body in the water kind of research. It's a sort of ground truthing approach to doing research that in phenomenological terms goes back to the thing itself. Yeah. What does being in the tactile, sensuous presence of others in the field give you? Yeah. The field is in the thick of things. But the field is also more than this. Field work works in an expanded field. So the field is also a specific somewhere, someplace, something that can be sensed. Your knowing body is always in and of a field. The key thing here is that the field, therefore, always presumes relation, a relationship between elements or bodies or matters in the field. Field work always implies more than just me, the researcher, the author, the thinker, the knower. In the field, there is always a crowd. Okay? So the important thing here is that when I do field work, I'm looking not just at myself as a knowing body, but like, who am I in relation to whatever I find in the somewhere, sometime, something, the field that I've defined. In many ways, if you're familiar with the short story the short essay by Ursula Le Guin, Carrier Bag, Theory of Fiction, the field is like the carrier bag, like Le Guin's carrier bag that holds things in relation. Yeah, it's a specific defined thing that holds things in relation. So field work starts with feeling bodies within a field. These are like the two primary sort of foundations of the method or the tactics that I've come to explore. And then what I want to do next in about 10 minutes is run through, I think I have 10 lessons for fieldwork. So I don't want to like show them to you as though they are rules or like set in stone things that must be followed. They're more like guiding principles for me that orient myself as a feeling body in a field. And I know this kind of still sounds a bit abstract. And when I get to the examples, I'm hoping it will make a little bit more sense. But it's really important for me as a researcher that I outline the methodology so that when we get to the examples, you can read those examples through all of these lessons and principles that I'm going to articulate for you. So the first one, begin with the material. This was the lesson that I took from that trip I made to Kilpisjärvi, to the biological field station. Yeah. Field work does not begin with a theoretical position. It begins with a material situation. Usually when I begin a project that is going to involve field work, I think of something that confounds me, or I'm continually confronted by something that troubles me, something that lures me in or magnetizes me. It's not always a place, but it might be. It could be another kind of phenomenon, a situation that's like arisen that I'm just troubled by. But like all phenomena, it takes place again somewhere and sometime in the world. As a theorist, I strongly state that all thinking takes place in the world. There is no such thing as theorizing in the abstract. Yeah. So when I begin a project of fieldwork, the first thing I do is go to the material field that holds the phenomenon that is luring me in. So all phenomena are situated. Beginning with the material means finding the phenomenon in a some place and in a some time, positing the phenomenon as a question that I don't yet know the answer to, right? I already mentioned that as one of my key lessons from working with artists. So in other words, I begin by situating myself in a field among all the others that the field also holds. Begin with the material. The second principle that I orient myself with is begin with the geography closest in. This is partly the lesson from Sam Mallin's philosophy class, but also a lesson from all of the feminist writing and theory that brought me there in the first place. Looking to writers like Judith Butler and Gloria Anzaldúa and Audre Lorde, people who I was reading a lot before I came to my PhD studies. As Adrienne Rich said in her 1985 essay, Notes Toward the Politics of Location, begin with the geography closest in the body. So that's a quote from Rich. I've always carried this instruction with me, and it's really another grounding way that I begin fieldwork. Situate your body, articulate it with the somewhere, sometime field in which you find yourself. Tap into the knowledges, feeling, movement, sensation, memory, language, touch, sight, smell, whatever it is that your body does in order to feel its way into the world. 3, look around. Who's in the field with you? I could just as easily have said, listen around or feel around. The idea with the third principle is to figure out who you are sharing the field with. In other words, fieldwork is always collaborative. In the examples I'm going to show you at the end, sometimes these are collaborations with other researchers in groups of 2 or 3 or 4. Sometimes they're large-scale community collaborations, such as in the workshops that I've hosted or convened. But even when I'm seemingly doing field work, quote, by myself, there's still always a crowd of multi-being otherness, plants and wind and insects and atmospheres and weathers, terrains, buildings, surfaces, so on. Yeah, ghosts, hauntings. Being attentive to the others who comprise the field, who are held by the carrier bag of the field, is crucial. Yeah, this is with whom I'm going to seek resonances and pathways of relation, which is the fourth principle. Ask what resonates. So you're beginning with the material, you've articulated your field, you're beginning with the body closest in, or rather the geography closest in your body. You're looking around to see who else is in the field, and then you ask what resonates. The task of field work is to find new and unexpected pathways of connection. So for example, how does a crab carapace on a shoreline articulate with the poem that you have brought to read on that shoreline? How does a conversation you then have illuminate the texture that you might discover in the field, the texture of the stones beneath your feet or the water between your fingers? How does that crab shell or that poem or that conversation amplify and expand how you understand the field? What feeling emerges when you bring these things into relation? So resonance here is always a queer vector. Yeah. In field work, there are no proper objects of study, meaning there's nothing that you're supposed to look at and supposed to pay attention to. Instead, fieldwork is about looking for pathways of meaning that emerge when we put things that are not typically connected into conversation with one another in the field. So by doing this, a different kind of feminist environmental story can emerge. But that story is importantly always grounded in the field. And the field is what is like pulling out those resonances between these queer things that find themselves there together. Now, there are two additional points that I want to make about asking, what resonates. First of all, it's important to mention that what resonates is a matter of choice. All methodologies are about making choices. Again, that's why it's an ology, like a methodology. Ology implies a logic or a system or an application of a certain framework. So what we observe and how we make meaning are never just given. They're derived from how and where we train our attention, what we choose to deem significant, what we choose to focus on or bring into relation. And this is important because field work is a feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, queer, and crip methodology. So when I do field work, I make an explicit choice to notice these vectors of power and difference, where and how they are materialized or instantiated in hard to notice ways. If I can't find them, maybe I'm not paying attention to the right things. Or maybe I need to bring in different search for different kinds of relations. Or inversely, fieldwork can be about who or what isn't in the field with you, right? So you can feel for something that isn't there, and that can also be part of the method. Absence can be an important part of meaning making. When you're in a field, it's of course obvious that, the story won't hold all of those structures equally. Like every time you sort of engage in field work, it won't be like anti-oppression in terms of feminism, anti-racism, anti-coloniality, inclusion, accessibility, that all of these things will be equally present and vibrating. Usually some things emerge and other things fade into the background. So there are some vectors that may be more significant than others. And the work of field work is to feel these things out, explicitly make the choice to ask the question, to notice how these vectors reverberate in the field, but then also, notice maybe what isn't there. The work is to feel these things out in both their joyful and their troubling manifestations. The second proviso is remembering that what resonates is also a matter of chance. Just because something arrives unexpectedly does not mean that it can't be part of your data set. Yeah. The methodology of fieldwork welcomes chance and serendipity. They are no less valid because they arrive unexpectedly. In fact, given that one of the ambits of fieldwork is to tell unexpected stories, chance can be exactly the thing that sends an inquiry into a weird and wonderful direction that you didn't anticipate. So this happens like all the time when I do field work. I set up sort of an inquiry, I enter the field, and then something comes to me in a completely unanticipated way. You know, reading a certain paper in the field, or something arriving in my inbox that morning, or hearing a news story as I'm on my way there. The work of field work is never about setting up like a cordon, like a tightly patrolled perimeter around the field and only looking at what you've corralled inside. Instead, what you're going to do is make meaningful connections with whatever shows up. The fifth principle is about erotics. As a feminist methodology, fieldwork is erotic. Here I am absolutely 100% citing Audre Lorde and her essay, Uses of the Erotic. For Lorde, the erotic is feeling deeply, feeling in ways we are encouraged not to, and in ways that are often dismissed as apolitical or private. For Audre Lorde, the erotic and this kind of deep feeling is an agent of change. For Lorde, the erotic is relational. It's often mundane, like things, part of our everyday, but also transformative. It's not about using something that brings you into deep feeling for Lorde, but about establishing connection and feeling into it. It's joy and pleasure, not in spite of a context that might be difficult or violent or oppressive, but using deep feeling to interrupt those systems. So this is why it's so political for Audre Lorde. So fieldwork takes this principle of erotics from Audre Lorde and strives to be joyful even when the context is difficult. And activating that sort of joy through a sense of deep feeling. As a feminist methodology, fieldwork is also housework. Here I'm drawing on the work of my longtime colleague and collaborator, Jennifer Hamilton, who writes about the relationship between climate change and domestic caretaking. Jen's work reminds us that domestic labors, washing, cleaning, caring, tending, mending, doing it all over again every day, that these things are explicitly considered or must be considered part of any transformative politics. And I draw on Jen's work here to bring that insight to the method of fieldwork itself. So fieldwork means thinking about toilet breaks, good snacks, who's going to wash the dishes. Fieldwork is about comfortable shoes, a chair to rest in, who's going to bring out the litter, who's going to compost the tea bags. And these labors aren't farmed out, as something like extra to the method, but they're part of the method. And they remind us that doing that kind of housework is what enables us to do anything at all. 7, again, drawing on my collaborative work with Jennifer Hamilton, as a feminist methodology, fieldwork is composting. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time explaining our feminist theory of composting, but I just want to say that when I bring the idea of composting to my method of fieldwork, it means 2 things. First, because the work Jen and I did in our composting project was largely about a feminist politics of citation and sort of paying tribute to and honoring and doing justice to knowledges, and specifically feminist knowledges that preceded us. When we talk about fieldwork as composting, we mean activating that feminist politics of citation and honoring the commitments of thinkers that enabled me to come to the field with all sorts of ideas and thoughts, yeah? So fieldwork is non-extractive in this way. Secondly, fieldwork is composting because it has an ethos of sustainability, right? It's not about coming up with shiny new things, spaceship to Mars, fancy new concept, or, brand new research methodology. It's about rearranging things in order to see things from a new perspective. Reuse and recycle, especially when you are trying to grow new kinds of worlds. The 8th principle, I learned this again from artists. When you're lost, come back to the material. Trust the process, get out of your head, and go back to the thing itself. 9, this is my favorite one right now. I'm thinking a lot about it. Instead of truth, fieldwork looks for honesty. And for me, this is what sets fieldwork apart from a lot of the scholarly work that surrounds me as an academic researcher in a university. In a lot of this work, the goal of a method is to win the argument, or to find the truth. We often do this or are encouraged to do this by semantic or rhetorical or analytical means. You offer up a truth, then you support it with logic or data or fancy wordsmithing that is irrefutable, right? We're encouraged to become irrefutable. But fieldwork is more interested in honesty, vulnerability, messiness, partial truth, humility, all of these things often coming out of an inability to know, to thinking about what we can't know or don't have access to. So truth may be what stands up in court, but honesty is what you feel in your belly. And honesty is a feeling. And that's what I'm trying to go for in my method. And finally, fieldwork considers reciprocity. What do you owe and how will you pay? Fieldwork is an ethical project. It's a research methodology, but it's also an ethos. It wants to avoid what Eve Tuck has called damage stories, so always focusing on damaged communities or violence or marginalization. And it wants to also avoid extractive research, like pulling research out of the world for our own gain. The field and its inhabitants have given me so much. So fieldwork is always also about asking, what does my research give back to the field? So those 10 principles are sort of how I orient myself as I go into the field, into this collaborative space that is, grounded in my feeling body and seeking to look for those unexpected resonances with whatever it is around me. And these are principles, as I'm looking back over my shoulder at the last 10 years, that I realize I've been bringing to a lot of the projects that I've started to experiment in as I left my sort of bookish world of doing philosophy, to the side and tried to engage in a more activist, worldly, embodied way of doing theory. So I'm going to end this talk with about 5 to 10 minutes of examples. I won't be able to, sort of lay them out in a lot of fulsome detail for you, but I'll just sketch out 3 different ways that I have activated this thing that I'm calling fieldwork, and then hopefully we can have a little bit of a conversation. And before I get to the examples, once again, I just want to stress that although maybe that fieldwork still feels a bit abstract to you as an audience or a listener, it was really important for me to lay out those principles first because I am a researcher. Yeah, I'm not an artist. I'm not a community organizer. I'm actually a theorist, and I'm really interested in sort of keeping a bit of those differences alive. Like, what does it mean to do field work rather as a researcher, not as an artist or a community activist, say? How is this, what I'm about to show you in these examples, how are these research methods rather than, community events that I've hosted or artistic performances? Yeah, they're research methods that help me sort of learn things about the world and then, translate that back to a scholarly audience as well. Okay, so let's end with some pretty pictures of some hopefully interesting examples. The first kind of example I want to talk about is what I have been calling for many years the walk shop as fieldwork. Walk shops are generally convened with groups of people. Sometimes there are 5 or 6. One of the examples I'm going to show you had closer to 100. And it's a way of moving through the world in conversation with other bodies that are not necessarily like you. Walk shops are often convened such that we can have stops along the way where we are, encouraged to participate in some kind of activity, or we listen to a particular kind of information from somebody who may have been invited to, animate a certain stop along the way. But the real sort of value, I think, of walk shops is that along the way and between those stops, people who don't know each other are having conversations. Their bodies are filled with what they're learning from the path of the walk, from the information, from the activities, and then they're processing or metabolizing that information in their bodies and in the company of others as they walk to see what resonates. So one example is this one. It was called The River Ends as the Ocean. We being myself, Sydney-based artist Claire Britton and Auntie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, in 2021, it was the very end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021 when I was leaving Sydney, we convened this public performance walk in January where we walked from the starting point of the Cooks River, which is in a little gurgling drain in a golf course in the inner west of Sydney, and we followed the path of that river until it became the ocean. The walk was grounded in Annie Rhonda's personal story of country as an elder and a custodian of knowledges on those lands. And our only task on that walk shop was to slow our bodies down to walk as slowly as the outgoing tide, so that we would rhyme our bodies with the rhythm of the river until we reached its mouth. There were, I think, close to 100 people on that walk, and most of the substance of the walk, as I mentioned, happened in the conversations along the way. Another walk that I want to share with you briefly actually just happened last week. It was the culmination of a 1.5-year-long, still ongoing collaboration with LA-based artist Patty Chang and my sister, Alexia Neimanis, who is a veterinary pathologist. And it was called Care for the Stranded. It was hosted by the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle. And we walked down to the shore, which was the site of a humpback whale stranding in 2016. And we learned about how scientists care for these stranded animals through a process of necropsy, but also in walking together, animated by different kinds of feelings, by the cello music of cellist Anne Bourne, by the stories of Duwamish Tribal Council member Ken Workman, by activities such as humming to protect our inner ear and washing each other's hands as we reached the shoreline. We came to understand bodily what it could mean to care for the stranded in these times, in these places, which include, of course, not only marine mammals, but so many others. That walk was about 3 hours long and included about 40 or 50 people who really, none of us knew each other when we began, but we ended the walk knowing something quite intimate about the fields that we shared together. A second kind of fieldwork that I just want to briefly introduce to you is more, kind of more traditionally what we would call a research method. So this is a kind of research that I did with a group of other researchers, Tess, Lindsay, Toby, and Stella, where we were going to present at the ASA conference in Honolulu. And as you may know, if you're an academic who attends conferences, what you usually do is you arrive with your prepared paper and you give it to the audience. And that audience is in Honolulu or Austin or, Albuquerque or London or, Sydney, and it doesn't really matter where that conference is taking place. What we did in this particular instance is we decided to arrive in Honolulu a week before and undertake a series of fieldwork exercises to integrate the short papers and ideas that we brought with us to the conference, to find how those questions of everyday militarism were also present at the conference site in Honolulu in various different ways. And then through this kind of collaborative practice-based research over the span of a week, what we ended up presenting at the conference was our own research integrated with fieldwork results that specifically then situated our research in the site of the conference. And we did this through a performative, a performance paper, let's call it, that the four of us did together, produced by Stella. It was amazing, and I wish all conferences would happen this way, and I could give all conference papers this way. And I'm happy to say a bit more about that in the questions. And then I want to just end briefly with another example of fieldwork, which is what I'm doing right now on these unseeded silk territories here in Kelowna at my newly emergent field lab. And it's an activity that we call Fringe Natures. Fringe Natures is a series of low-stakes, come-as-you-are gatherings that we host about monthly, where whoever wants to show up can. We'll have organized a pretty, low vulnerability, low-stakes activity for people to engage in as a way to think about, who we are in this place together and in relation to our differences and obligations as bodies on and as this land. All of the principles that I outlined earlier about fieldwork, such as like housework and erotics and, staying with the material and beginning with your body, all of these things infuse these short, 2-hour activities that we host. And we explicitly frame them as a research method. Through these kinds of informal gatherings, we're coming to understand not only this place as something that is separate from ourselves, but something that we are in the process of co-making. We do this through these kinds of Fringe Natures research gatherings. So those are a few examples of some of the ways in which this idea of fieldwork has been activated for me, over the last decade or so. And I'm really now delighted to have a little bit of a conversation about them.
Thank you, Astrida. That was very generous and provoked more curiosity, because the projects are kind of endless. No, it's many years of collaborations, also different geographies. Every river has its history, and we have to honor, the time that it takes even to land and to ground ourselves as researchers, and to land with doubts and as listeners, with open ears and with less certainties and that sometimes some research forces to do. So I really appreciated in your talk how you put honesty in the foreground, and this honesty that admits this inability to know at some point, and that recognizes that many things we don't know yet, we might never know. Part of my research also starts from this inquiry and a certain humility towards, for example, the ocean, and how we relate to an ecosystem we will never visit with our bodies. So how can we do, develop research projects when sometimes the sensorial constraints or the imaginative constraints are not always explicit, but they always also give us creativity to think otherwise. So I think your talk was very generative, and I think it will be a toolbox actually for researchers to expand on their methods and expand on their research. So maybe, to start and to bring back to, a book that we all love. And I think it's so important to go back to the matter, as you say. So I would make the question that, probably many people would do is, how has thinking with water shaped your practice? And what is thinking with water?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And it's interesting, so Thinking with Water was published in 2013. Bodies of Water was published in 2017. And I think both of those texts for me were training to get to where I am now. So in both of those texts, I was still primarily a philosopher and a theorist in my head. I was already activating the practice of body hermeneutics that I was learning from Samuel Malin. And I was, really being in the world, in water, with water, alongside water, unable to go into water, like all of these things as ways to really try to understand what water is through the knowledges of my body. But in both of those texts, the one of which I was an editor and the second, the sole author, I think I was still, it's funny to say this now because I do think, I'm very proud of both of those books, but I do think there's been a big shift in my practice since then. And what I presented to you in my talk today is probably mostly sort of what's come after the research for bodies of water. It's kind of like that writing Bodies of Water, although it was published in 2017, actually I did most of the research for it, like from 2006 to 2010. Like honestly, it was my PhD research. That's when I sort of trained my body to become a knower, to sort of stop knowing just here, but knowing here, everywhere. And so really writing that was like really sort of getting ready for what was to come next, which was to be more courageous, more honest, less hiding behind philosophers and texts and words, and testing things out in the world. This is a beautiful theory, but how does it actually look or feel or sense when it is put into practice in the world with other bodies, other human bodies, their histories, other non-human bodies, their disappearances, their extinctions, their difficulties, their annoyances. Field work and collaboration can be very fraught and tense and difficult. It's not always just a, beautiful, rosy thing. So, that honesty that sort of drives my practice now, I'm ready for it because I train myself in those ways to really pay attention to phenomena in the world with my body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this process is also so connected with this training that you mentioned, with unlearning certain things that are, have been shaping the infrastructures and the social spheres around us, the energetic spheres, even how we use language. So I think really reconnecting with the core and some reciprocity within each exchange of the method, of the wording, of the being in a place, really then shifts what it comes through it. And it's really fascinating how this openness is so rewarding and creative. So maybe it's something which I thought was very beautiful that can be an interesting point here is on finding that the teaching and the being outside in the field builds always a different set and forms of knowledge and sensorial awareness and availability. I think there's some beautiful passages from fieldwork to activism and through also personal healing work. So I think these passages are quite interesting to speak about. Maybe you would like to say something.
That's really beautiful, and I hope so, and I think so. However, as you were speaking there and preparing that question, what I was thinking to myself was like, oh, remember, Astrida, to say that you're a writer, because, we all have talents and skills, and it's great when we learn new ones, but it's also good to hone what you're particularly good at. And what is interesting to me is that the real hard work often for me comes then in using this research method, field work, to write something that says something new, or different or useful or valuable to others. And again, the difficult part is finding a way to articulate what I feel in the field in words in a way that is honest, right? It's not just relying on the same phrases that we've all come to know and love, stay with the trouble, go back to the things themselves. these are entanglements that are interacting, like we all have this vocabulary now. And it's wonderful because authors such as, Haraway and Barad have given us these words to change how we experience the world, like I think quite literally. But like all words, they become sedimented and they stop having the power, and they become like easy habits and maybe even a bit lazy habits. Yeah. So the work that I think is mine to do as a writer is to find new forms of writing, of putting, the same old words together in new ways that can create, again, new and different ways of experiencing the world, of feeling our obligations to it, our joy from it, our, sadness in it as well. Like all of those things require adequate and honest expression. So I really, as a researcher and a theorist and a writer, that's also my work to do then, is like, how do I then translate it adequately and honestly into words? And I mean, I'd like to think that Bodies of Water did some of that work, found a vocabulary to say something in maybe a slightly new and different way. But again, that can become sedimented and it becomes sort of a cliche. We're all connected through water. Yes, 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 we know this. So now again, what are the new ways we can start to train our bodies, and how can words and writing be a tool or, a piece of equipment that can help us learn to be in the world in new or different ways?
Mm-hmm. And then let's maybe go back to the question and go from fieldwork to words to activism, and how these tools can be engaging or empowering. And so I wanted to hear from you, maybe throughout your path, you've been connected with different activist movements or particular mining struggles. I don't know. Would you like to share some of these stories?
Sure. I also want to sort of preface it by saying that there are many activists who do amazing work, whom I continue to learn from, and my work will never even come close to doing the kinds of things that they are doing. And very often, I think my own best activist work is as a teacher in the classroom and as a writer, and I really take seriously my role in both of those ways and think about how it can connect up to activism. And I don't sort of purport to be a frontline activist. It's not what I'm maybe best at. That said, I have had the incredible privilege to work with people like Annie Rhonda Dixon Grosvenor, whose image you saw in the images from the Sydney Walk Shop, The River Ends as the Ocean, who is doing incredible, hard, long-standing care work for country on Gadigal land and other lands, country in Sydney, climate activism, Indigenous land activism, activism that is really valuable. And to be able to collaborate with Annie Rhonda on that walk was such a gift. And she, of course, brought to that walk many of her connections. And then, I brought to the walk my own connections, as Claire Britton did, and her connections. And for all of us, so, the walk shop here is such an interesting, what I would call feminist infrastructure, because it holds and sort of channels all of these different bodies together along this path as they move into and out of one another's space, talking, sharing. The most interesting things on the walk shop are always the things that I'm not even aware of, the connections that have been made, the phone numbers that are exchanged, the protest that is organized, the chapbook that is then produced, those kinds of things that this infrastructure of a walk shop can hold is, I think, what the activism can then, emerge from in different ways. So again, it's not that I necessarily see myself as an activist, but as somebody who can provide that infrastructure or carrier bag or field from which different collaborations, often activist or academic or artistic, can grow and sprout from in new ways. and to provide that time and space, you know, to hold those bodies, human and more than human, so that they have this sort of comfort and safety, you know, usually a little bit vulnerable, but sort of low stakes vulnerability, to be able to safely reach across difference and make those connections. That's what I see as like some of the real value of this kind of work.
That's beautiful. And I have a feeling we should maybe end here, because I think this statement really wraps up some of the conversation today. Of course, there are always more questions, but we can exchange soon again. And I really thank you, Astrida, for taking the time and being so generous with us as always, and inspiring. And I hope we can cross again. Do watch the other videos who's online. They're all a data bank for researchers and practitioners in the field. There are plenty of good stories of field work and different contexts at site. So our next session is with A.M. Kangizer, that also was in a workshop with Astrida, a sound theorist, a feminist scholar, fantastic thinker as well, and will be a pleasure to join us. Thank you, Astrida, for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.